All right, well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, and people may continue to join as we're going. But thank you everyone for attending today's MacEwan Celebrates Month of Scholarship presentation. My name is Kathy Miller, and I'll be the moderator for this event. So I am a faculty member in the Faculty of Nursing. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather in Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, language, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. The First Peoples' connection to the land teaches us about our inherent responsibilities to protect and respect Mother Earth. With this acknowledgement, we honor the ancestors and children who have been buried here, missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, and the process of ongoing collective healing for all human beings. We are reminded that we are all treaty people and of the responsibility we have to one another. So with that, today we are joined by Dr. Dianna Dempsey, Assistant Professor in the Bachelor of Commerce. Her presentation, Bridging the Gap, Career Resilience in the School to Work Transition. So there will be time for questions at the end, but if you have questions during the presentation, Dr. Dempsey has said that she's perfectly happy to be interrupted and to address questions. So please type all your questions into the chat, and I will moderate and ask the questions on your behalf. Just so you know, so there you will not be identified in that way. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dempsey. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you for taking the time to be here, everyone, and for Kathleen to moderating the panel and doing our land acknowledgement, etc. I really appreciate that. So as Kathleen mentioned, my name is Dianna Dempsey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Business here at MacEwan. My pronouns are she and her, just so everyone knows. And as Kathleen mentioned, I'm quite happy to be interrupted. I know that that looks really different, and we were sort of joking about that before. The session looks really different in a virtual session, but as she noted, please feel free, raise your hand, put in the chat if you have a question throughout. So given the overall theme of MacEwan's sort of month of scholarship around resilience, and given obviously many of the world events this year, part of that theme is around resilience. And so I was asked to talk a little bit about my research that relates to resilience. So I'm happy to be here today to do that. So what I thought might be interesting first is if I just let you know a little bit about me, because I know sometimes, we see these presentations and it's a little bit of this floating virtual face and we don't really know what that person is all about. So this is a little bit about me, both personal and professional. So I'm a parent. You can see there sort of on the left-hand side of your screen, that's my daughter, both when she was very tiny, sort of T-minus 5 years to kindergarten, and then the bottom is her now. And a lot of my work that I do around resilience and careers, and you'll see a little bit about the role of gender in careers, a lot of it I do for her in the hopes that, one day the world will look a little bit different for girls than it might have historically. So me here at MacEwan, what I do, you see sort of on the right-hand side, three images. So I have three parts, I guess, to my job here at MacEwan, one of which is research, which is represented by that careers chalkboard there, which I'll get into today. Another part is service to the university and my profession. And the bottom part actually is a picture of my human resources students, and I'll talk about that. I teach primarily human resources here at MacEwan. My human resources students in the Roundhouse here at MacEwan, obviously not this year, but this was a couple of years ago, giving a presentation where they developed a training program that they were giving to a community partner organization. So experiential learning is a big part of my teaching pedagogy, and it's something that's really important to me. And so I wanted to, again, just kind of share a little bit about me so that I'm not sort of this nameless, faceless person in terms of, why I do the research I do, because I think that's important to talk about too. It's what drives my various research interests. So, oops, sorry, I went back, not forward. So how did I get here? Again, just to give you kind of an overview, because this also informs today's kind of what the research project I want to talk about. So I'm a human resources professional. I've worked for over 10 years in the field of human resources in varying capacities with varying organizations in the public sector, the private sector. And so I'm also certified as what's called a chartered practitioner in human resources, or CPHR. And I'm also certified through a body in the United States called the Society for Human Resources Management as what they call a senior certified professional in human resources. So I've worked for a long time in the day-to-day practice of human resources. I started out my education actually though as an arts and science student, which is the best possible preparation I think that I ever could have had. And so I went to the University of Guelph, and I like to tell my students at the time when I went to undergrad, there was no such thing as a Bachelor of Commerce with a specialization in HR. It didn't exist. And so I sort of fell into psychology because I was interested in people and I was interested in their careers. And I was interested in, why does someone choose to be, for example, a neurosurgeon? The questions like that really fascinate me. And then I started working, and then I went back to school at Queen's in Ontario, and I did my master's degree in human resources and industrial relations. Fantastic, wonderful experience. Really enjoyed that program. And that sort of cemented for me that HR was the area that I was interested in, that human resources was what I wanted to do. But then after that, again, I went and I worked for a number of years, and I was always drawn back into this idea of the academic side of things. Again, I watched all of these HR types of issues unfold before me in the various organizations I worked in, but I always had a level of curiosity behind, why is that happening? Why are people behaving the way they are? Why do teams function the way that they do? I'll talk a bit. I also study entrepreneurs, etc. And so I was really drawn back into a more academic side of things. Again, I knew HR was what I loved, but I wanted to do it from a more academic perspective. So fast forward a number of years, and I ended up back at the University of Alberta in their business school. And I was there to do my PhD, which is in an area called strategic management and organizations. And so that area encompasses everything from, as it alludes to, strategy, human resources, organizational behavior, family business, and entrepreneurship. And so my dissertation was about, it was called The Push and Pull of Entrepreneurial Careers, Reflections on Entrepreneurial Self-Efficacy. So coming from a background in psychology, I was really interested in cognitions, right? In cognitive psychology and industrial organizational psychology. And so we call self-efficacy a cognition, right? So in other words, the thought process that people engage in. And so I was interested in, well, why would people go and, work for existing organizations? So like an existing organization like MacEwan, why would someone choose to work for MacEwan versus work for themselves? What helps people make that decision? And so my dissertation was all about that and about sort of a sub area of entrepreneurship that's called intrapreneurship, or intrapreneurship is about entrepreneurial behaviors within existing organizations. And I found it had a lot to do with the HR practices that an organization has to offer. So again, a big firm like MacEwan or any other big organization will very often have things like a competitive compensation that they offer their employees. They might have training and development. They might have professional development. They might have all manner of things that would attract you to come and work for MacEwan as the organization versus on your own. But on the other side of it, if that is not attractive to you, maybe you say, well, why would I work for these people when I could be over here doing my own thing? Okay, so that's sort of how I got to kind of where I am today. I'll see if I can move this screen. Oh, somehow I've lost my ability to move the slide. Hang on here. Sorry, everyone. But somehow, oh, there we go. Sorry, it was stuck. Okay, so what do I study then? What am I broadly interested in terms of research? So big picture, I'm interested in career decisions, career paths, and transition. So again, why do people choose the careers that they do? And also, I mean, some people don't necessarily actively choose. They sort of, as we call it, they sort of fall into various careers, right? They start doing one thing and that leads to the next, etc. So I study all of those types of decisions, different periods in people's careers. You'll hear in a minute about the school to work transition. So that's a big sort of path and decision point in a person's career. I also very heavily study gender diversity and what are called STEM career paths. So STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. So obviously women, largely speaking, generally speaking, are very underrepresented in many of those career paths. And so I'm interested in gender diversity in those, as well as entrepreneurial career paths. So why do women choose to become entrepreneurs versus not? What are some of the barriers to that decision and that career path for women? I also study HR practices and career paths in family businesses. So family businesses are another, very prominent form of business. They're a very unique context in which to study something like careers, right? When you think of a business being a group of family members, that's a very, very specific and unique context. And then as you'll hear about today, I studied the school to work transition. And so there's varying definitions for that, which I'll talk about, but the idea behind the school to work transition is that it's sort of the first major step in an individual's career. So this is where they're transitioning from some sort of education to basically full-time work, kind of as their primary thing that they're doing in their life. Okay. So again, just to give you an idea of kind of what I do and what I write about, some recent publications. So again, studying HR practices in family firms. In this 2018 publication, we were taking some theoretical insights from the step family literature. So again, a little bit different, but the step family literature, and talking about how that might apply to how HR practices unfold in family firms. So traditionally, many people think, well, family members are better treated, right? Because they are family members. But actually, usually the opposite is true, that very often that family members are not treated as well as outside employees. So we were chatting in that paper a little bit around some ideas around, again, adopting kind of what can step families tell us about how family businesses might work. And then the 2014 publication, again, back to sort of my interest in gender and entrepreneurial careers. So talking about, how entrepreneurial self-efficacy develops differently in people who identify as male versus female, and why that's important, right, for this decision to either become or not choose entrepreneurship as a career choice. A couple of things, last quick thing before we kind of jump into today's topic. Again, just to give you an idea of what I work on. A lot of my recent work, again, has been around women's decision to pursue entrepreneurial careers versus not, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the entrepreneurship literature, women are often characterized as being pushed into entrepreneurship. So we call it push versus pull reasons for becoming an entrepreneur. We often say that women are pushed into entrepreneurship out of necessity. So for example, they might lose a job and therefore have to start their own business because they may not be able to find another one. Whereas men, very often the explanation that's dominant in the literature is that they are pulled, right? So they're, it's great and fun and exciting to be an entrepreneur. So that's why I'm going to pursue it. As a result of that, though, women are often characterized in the entrepreneurship literature as being underconfident. And in a lot of this work that I'm doing right now, we're actually arguing a little bit that argument is not right. That actually, instead of being underconfident, women are actually more realistic about whether or not they can succeed as an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurship is a very hard, a very tough career choice. Lots of entrepreneurs fail. And so a lot of the work I've been doing is around understanding that and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not that women are underconfident. Maybe it's actually that they're more realistic, and maybe the men are overconfident in their ability to be entrepreneurs. So just changing the framing and the language with which we talk about some of that. I'm also working on a book chapter around the employee experience of HR practices in small to medium-sized enterprise. So again, in Canada, small to medium-sized enterprise is the dominant form of business. And again, it's a very unique context in which to study HR practices. Sometimes we think of, again, the big companies, right, that we might go and work for. Well, of course, they have an HR department. And of course, they have very salient or, HR practices that we recognize. Small businesses don't always have that. And so, what is the employee experience of the HR function in the small businesses? Also working on some work around what Indigenous conceptualizations of family can teach us about family business. Again, obviously Indigenous conceptualizations of family are very unique and very different from a Eurocentric or Western view of family. And so what can we learn about that in terms of family businesses? And then finally, a lot of the work that I do is around gender diversity in STEM careers. So some of the work is also about identity construction of female engineers. So engineering, again, is a very sort of standalone and specific profession. And I'm very interested in, obviously, women are underrepresented, again, in that. And I'm interested in, in terms of that, how do they come to understand themselves as engineers? Okay. So that's sort of, again, the work I do. And I share that just to give you kind of a brief overview, again, because sometimes we see these standalone research projects and kind of wonder, well, how did that come to be? Or, why is this person working on that? And so hopefully that gives you a sense for some of the work that I do in my research work. So that brings us to today. So in particular, this project that I'm going to talk about, my working title for it is Bridging the Gap, the career transition, the career resilience in the school to work transition. Okay, and so again, as the image represents, it's sort of someone who's going from being a full-time student, or for where school is sort of the more central part of their lives, to where work is sort of the most central or dominant part of your life. So full disclosure, this is an early stage project. So this is not a project that's finished. This is something that's in the works, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in my next steps. But the guiding question for this line of my research is sort of how can we assist emerging adults to develop their human and social capital, their identities, and their adaptability to enable their employability in early career stages. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. But we know that the school, again, that school to work transition, or that major transition that happens I prefer the term emerging adults, because I think when we say young adults, we assume everyone is the same age, and they're not necessarily. So I use the term emerging adults. But when people are making that transition, whenever that is, from school to work, how can we ensure that they do so successfully? Because there's some pretty big implications if they're not successful in that transition. And so some of the constructs you'll hear me talk about that are part of this, obviously, are something called career resilience, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that is in a minute. Reality shock, and then, of course, just the school to work transition itself. So why do we care about the school to work transition? Again, I've talked a little bit about this, but we know, and there's a huge and ever evolving literature on the fact that this transition is so important, and that there is actual utility or benefit of actually developing career resilience in educational settings, even before people leave school. So whether that's high school, whether that's post-secondary, whether that's a vocational institution, any of those institutions, there's utility in helping the students develop some of that career resilience before they even leave school. There's also utility in developing it in organizational settings where, new graduates are starting work, right? Where they kind of land for the first time and are kind of going, whoa, what just happened here? Because it is a big transition and very often a shock. And we know, again, that emerging adults who are entering the workforce can benefit from these interventions because across the board, we know that if you have a better start to your career, that fosters better outcomes for you across your career span. So if you get started well, and this is a generalization, but if you get started well, generally the rest of your career, not to say that it's easy, but you just have a better footing to work from. If that initial school to work transition fails, which it often does for many individuals, that has other ramifications for the rest of their career. Okay, so again, in business, we often try and bring it back a little bit to something more practical. And in this case, we literally talk about the fact that this costs our economies millions of dollars every year when the school to work transition fails. Okay. So the research questions that guide, or I hope will guide this piece of research are sort of twofold with some sub-questions. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about what these specific constructs mean in a minute. But first question is, what is the relationship between levels of career resilience and objective versus subjective success of the school to work transition for emerging adults? So in the careers literature, we talk about the idea of objective versus subjective career success. And objective career success might be something like, what's your salary? What position did you obtain? Did you obtain the position that you wanted to, or did you have to accept a different position? Subjective successes are more things like, are you satisfied? Are you happy? Do you see a path forward in your career? Are you a good fit with the organization that you joined? All of these things are considered measures of so-called success in that transition. And just basically, does career resilience impact that? So do people, in other words, do people who maybe have higher levels of career resilience when they start that transition, does that lead to better outcomes? I would hypothesize it does, but that's an empirical question to be tested. Second research question, do levels of career resilience impact the experience of something called reality shock? And again, I'll talk about what reality shock is in a minute during that school to work transition. So very often in these new graduate settings or the school to work transition, we hear stories in our interviews that we do, our focus groups about, wow, work is so different than school. There's so much that I wasn't expecting. It was a shock for me. This transition was a shock. I was not prepared for, the workplace that I landed in. And so again, what is the impact of high levels of reality shock? So if someone's really experiencing that shock heavily, does that have an implication for the success of the school to work transition? I would argue that it does. And does career resilience impact levels of that shock? So in other words, if you are more resilient, do you have less shock and therefore a better outcome in that school to work transition? So those are the research questions that I'm hoping to ask in this particular project. From a theoretical side of things, in this particular project, I'm going to be using a theory called social cognitive career theory. So some of you may have heard of the idea of social cognitive theory, which is, of course, Albert Bandura, who's from Alberta, but is a very, very famous psychologist out of Stanford. He developed something called social cognitive theory, which has now been applied to careers. And in the context of careers, it's based on the idea that the relationship between self-efficacy, outcome expectations, and goals as they pertain to career choice influence, again, career outcomes. So in other words, if you think you can do a particular career, if you have very specific, goals and expectations around that career, you're more likely to want to do it. So, how this shows up sometimes, for example, if we talk again about gender diversity in careers, we know that, again, young girls, young women very often don't have role models or what we would call referent others in many of these STEM careers. So when they look around in these careers, they don't see someone who looks like them. And so for them, then it's very, very hard to believe that they can do these careers because they aren't building that efficacy or that sense that I can do this. Okay. A challenge or a criticism, of course, of this, though, is that it emphasizes personal agency, right? The fact that you have a choice in the matter. In many groups, particularly minority disadvantaged groups, have raised a very valid point that not everyone necessarily has agency, and so that's something to keep in mind in this. It's definitely not a perfect theoretical foundation. So what am I again interested in this? Again, the school to work transition is again just that period where a person transitions from the role of student to the role of worker. And again, that can be between, after high school, can be after post-secondary, can be after, again, some sort of vocational training. The idea is just that you're going from a period in your life where school is the main focus to where work is the main focus. And in that transition, I'm interested in career resilience. And the idea behind career resilience is that it's an individual's resistance to potential career disruption. Okay. Resilience itself, of course, it does not come from business. And resilience itself, again, often comes out of areas like social work, psychology, a lot of sort of the helping professions. And the idea being, can a person go through a time of adversity and come out the same or better off on the other end? And if they can, why? And in our context, particularly in careers here in business, we take this to mean, okay, so can an individual navigate the various ups and downs of their careers? And if they can, what is it about them that enables them to do that? And then again, the last one I'm kind of interested in is reality shock. And where reality shock was initially investigated in the 1970s and 80s was actually in teaching and nursing professions. It has a very long history in both of those. And in both of these settings, basically sort of graduates from both teaching and nursing programs were evaluated as they transitioned from those programs, those educational programs, into the workforce. And the idea behind it, again, is it's that period of what we call organizational socialization, or again, when they're joining the organization, working for an organization is a lot different than going to school. And sometimes there's a discrepancy between the new graduates' expectations and the realities of that workplace. And when that happens, we call that a reality shock, according to this construct. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a project I have not done yet, but this is something that I'm in the process of working on starting up. And so my next steps in terms of this project, I'd like to apply for what's called an SSHRC. And for those who are not familiar with that, it's the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And they have a grant called a Partnership Engage grant. And the idea behind this type of grant is that it's meant for an academic or a researcher to partner with a not-for-profit or other sort of organization to investigate a problem or concern for that organization that's also of interest to the researcher. And as I mentioned, sort of off the top, I've worked for a long time in STEM settings, in particular engineering settings. And so I have a longstanding relationship with the professional body that governs engineers and geoscientists here in Alberta, and they're called the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta. The acronym is APEGA, and I've worked with APEGA on a number of projects over the years. And engineering, again, is a very particular professional setting, right? So this can apply to other professional settings, but I would like to investigate it in this one because it's one of particular interest to me. So the goal of this project would be to study that school to work transition of approximately 10,000 members in training with APEGA. So APEGA at any given time, this number fluctuates slightly, but has approximately 10,000 members in training. And just to back up a little bit is that for engineering in Canada, generally what happens is people go and they take a 4-year undergraduate degree in engineering. Then once they finish that degree, they have to register with the professional body, which again in Alberta is APEGA. And they have to complete an additional 4 years of professional training. During that time, they have to be supervised by what's called a responsible member or a responsible professional, which is a registered engineer in this case. And they have, over that 4 years, basically how it looks in a professional setting is they're doing work, but they can't sign off on the work. So basically they're working under the supervision and the mentoring of this registered professional engineer for that 4 years while they learn in that setting. And so a lot of anecdotal evidence over my years of working with APEGA and again in these engineering companies in the engineering field is that they lose a phenomenal amount of their members in training in that second sort of 4-year training phase after school has ended. And they're not quite sure why. They have some ideas why. Of course, we have some ideas, but they're really not sure, what is it exactly that's leading to this loss? I mean, these folks have gone and they've taken and invested a significant amount of time, money, and energy in taking this 4-year undergraduate degree in engineering. And then we start to lose them when they join the workforce. Why is that? What's happening? And so this project would basically be to investigate that transition over that 4-year period. Now, again, with this Partnership Engage grant, it's only a year, so it would only be part of that project. It would be to investigate a lot of these questions around that. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight, but I'm happy to talk, to entertain questions or feedback about this, but hopefully this gives you kind of an overview of some of my research work. So thank you. Oh, Kathleen, I still can't hear you somehow.
Sorry. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Dr. Dempsey. That was very interesting. I feel like we were just getting into the topic, so we'll have to have you come back and report again when you've done the study. So as I mentioned, questions, you can type them into the chat and I will moderate all of that. So the chat is open. Feel free to ask your questions.
So I see one here. I'm just kind of watching a little bit here too. So it says, what are the guesses for losing the new engineers? So that's a great question. So organizational socialization is another whole kind of area of research that's separate from mine yet related. Some of it we hypothesize is the work environment itself. So engineering is a harsh reality, and very often the professional practice of engineering. This keeps deans of engineering schools up at night a lot, because very often the professional practice of engineering is not reflected necessarily in the education. So in other words, these people are very technically sound when they graduate from school. They're very technically sound engineers. You know, whatever area of engineering they've pursued, you know, they're very good at building bridges or, you know, treating, you know, chemicals, etc. Very good at that side of things. But when it comes to the realities then of entering a business setting and working with clients, working with colleagues, you know, project management, all of these types of things, things start to fall apart a little bit. And so, you know, the question is, you know, if we find that, you know, some of it is related to that, are there things that we could be doing in the undergraduate engineering programs to better prepare people for those realities of professional practice? And I think, again, this would pertain to a lot of professions, right? Not just engineering, but a lot of professions. I just particularly am interested in engineers. So there might be some of that. Also, some gender issues here too, right? Again, women are underrepresented. So in particular, I'm interested also in, you know, what happens. We know for female engineers, they represent roughly 10 to 20%, or 15 to 20% of people in sort of engineering programs in Canada. But that drops off to once they get to the end of that 4-year sort of period with the PEGA, where they can actually become a registered professional engineer, that drops off to about sort of 7 to 11% of registered professional engineers. And then further in their career, when they start to have families, that drops off again further, right? And so it's a very, very, it's borne out sort of time and time again that there are these very significant drop-offs in terms of leaving the profession of engineering at different points as well. And so again, there's a whole bunch of hypotheses around why that could be, and you know, what could we do about it? So hopefully that answers. I don't know. I'm curious though if there are other things as well that might be impacting that transition and what we can do about it. Probably more importantly.
So Dianna, there was a follow-up question, and I think you might have answered it, but here's a chance to say a bit more if you want. Asking, is there an equal rate of loss between men and women?
No, we lose more women. I don't know the specific percentages. And again, you know, we have to sort of take into account that women are underrepresented in the first place. So they're a smaller percentage in the first place. And it also depends on the area of engineering as well. So again, there's very sort of, engineering has very particular sort of sub areas. And again, the representation is different in those sub areas. So there's some areas of engineering that now are getting closer to parity. So for example, civil engineering in Canada, roughly about 30 to 40, even more than 40% now are women. Same thing with chemical engineering. Chemical engineering is getting closer to parity. But things like mining engineering, I think at last count, the last statistic I saw was that, you know, mining engineering is about 5% female right now. So again, it very much also depends on the sub area or sub practice of engineering that you're talking about. But no, the drop-off rate is different between men and women. But again, that, you know, that's also, it gets complex, right? Because of course there are fewer women to start with. So.
Thanks for that. just while I'm waiting for any more questions, I'm curious because you have done work with a broader spectrum of careers than just engineering. What do you see in general? You specifically talked about medicine and nursing. What do you see in terms of dropout rates from those careers? And again, is it different for men and women?
I'm interested, medicine and nursing, again, are a little bit different. Nursing still obviously primarily female dominated. And so it's almost the inverse, right? But I haven't studied nurses in particular, but I'd be really interested to, because I would wonder if those assumptions would hold in reverse. So in other words, would you have more men leaving the profession, or not? I don't know. Kind of interesting to explore. Medicine is another area that's, again, maybe not necessarily equal, certainly depending on the subspecialties, right? So for family medicine, I'm guessing it's probably roughly equal. For other specialty areas, I'm guessing may still be more male dominated. So I'm not sure what that would mean exactly, for this, but it's an excellent question. I think one worth definitely exploring in different professions. This would just be a starting point, again, because a lot of my research interest has been in these STEM careers. So I'm very interested in them, but definitely there's other ones on my radar, for sure.
Thank you. Any other questions? Just feel free. Oh, here's one. Are you planning to do any kind of a longitudinal study?
I'd like to, because again, I would like to follow people through this actual 4-year period. The Partnership Engage grant itself won't necessarily enable me to do that, because it's only a 1-year grant. But I would like it to be a starting point of a bigger project. So I almost view the Partnership Engage grant as looking at sort of a subset. And then hopefully, if I was able to secure funding down the road, I could be looking at a larger group over time, and particularly over that 4-year period, because that's really, I think, that's necessary to understand the whole experience, right? If we just do it cross-sectionally, or at one point in time, we're not capturing that full experience. Because I do think, if you think about it, they've just completed a 4-year undergraduate degree, and now they've essentially got to do another 4 years, albeit in a professional setting, so a different setting. But that is a significant investment, for the individual and for the organization. And so I think it would be great to understand that, over the longer term, and I'd like to do that.
Thank you. It's interesting. Again, just while I'm waiting for more questions, I'll just keep asking my questions. But
of course.
and again, I'll speak to nursing. It's interesting that when we graduate our students and we talk about them meeting entry to practice competencies and jumping straight into the workforce, versus sort of this idea of this bridging from school to then being an engineer in training or a member in training, and whether that might be beneficial for nurses to have some sort of a transition period. So it's interesting to hear you talk about some of the challenges of that. And I don't really have a question. I'm just chatting with you, actually.
Yeah, no, and it is a really interesting, you would think, right, that having this kind of built-in transition, that would be a buffer, right? Rather than just, other things where you're just thrown in, as you mentioned, right? Where you're just like, okay, you're done school, away you go. In engineering, there's that very defined kind of period where you are watched over by someone. But getting back to the person who kind of asked, why are they losing people? I also think maybe some of that 4-year period, maybe is not optimized. So, we know that people often get promoted in their careers because they're good at their technical area of expertise. So in this case, they get promoted because they're a good engineer. But then when they have to supervise someone who's a new engineer to the workplace, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a good supervisor of new engineers. Very often to the contrary, actually. So that, I think, also plays a role in it. And again, for our perspective in careers and in human resources, it's okay. then how can we help these people who are doing the supervising as well, right? Not just the individuals making that transition, but the people who are doing the supervising of this next generation of professionals to help them, because I think that that is a factor. I can't speak to nursing, but certainly in engineering, I would say that is a huge factor.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is another question here. It says, what are some of the examples of reality shock that makes a new worker leave their job in STEM or in nursing or nursing?
So that's a really good question. I don't know if I have specific examples necessarily to share with you, but the basic premise of it is that the new graduate, we'll call them, or the person who is making this transition from school to work, for whatever reason, sort of the cognitive schema that they've had in their mind about what it means to be an engineer or what it means to be a nurse, when they transition and they start working in those engineering workplaces, nursing workplaces, schools, if they're a teacher, when they start working in those workplaces, the reality is what's called reality shock. The realities of day-to-day life inside those organizations do not match up with the organizational schemas or the professional schemas that these people have had in their minds when they enter. And I mean, it's a great question about like why is there such a discrepancy in those things? Why are people not understanding the realities of professional practice in whatever their profession is? I don't have a great answer, but that would literally be it. Is someone would join the organization, and I can tell you as an HR professional, I've seen this a lot over the last 20 years that I've been involved in the HR profession. New graduate and whatever joins the organization and is just woefully unprepared for what they find, whether it's in terms of dealing with organizational politics or their colleagues, their clients, whatever it is. Just again, the sort of the schemas don't match up. And so there's kind of that experience of shock, like, wow, what just happened here? What happened to me? Why is this so different from what I thought it was going to be, right?
I know I've heard of examples from students, this is in nursing, that they're sort of taught best practice or the theoretical in school, and then they get out into the workforce and they're told repeatedly, yeah, we know that's what you were taught, but that's not how we do it here. So there's shortcuts and that often create some moral dilemma for these students and new graduates on actually how to practice. Anyway, there's another question for you.
Okay, sure.
Do you have any tips for challenges and reality shocks in a nonprofit organization workplace?
I would say just in general, not necessarily just in not-for-profits, but just in general, I would say that organizational socialization period, or sort of that onboarding process of a new employee, is so important. And many organizations kind of skip over this step, where they do it not in a great way. And so I've heard so many stories of like employee shows up the first day, nobody's there to greet them, their workplace is not set up, their work center isn't set up, they don't know where the washroom is, they don't know where to put their things, et cetera, et cetera. And so for any organization, again, not for profit or otherwise, that entry into the organization for most organizations could be optimized, and it's not right now, right? And so again, just being mindful and careful that if you have new individuals joining your organization, that you make sure that they have an onboarding process, an onboarding time, that they're little things, like, again, that they're introduced to people, that they know what their work is, that somebody sat down with them and said, okay, you've joined us as a, accounting clerk, let's say. Do you understand what your duties are as the accounting clerk? Like, let's make sure right off the bat, day one, that you and your supervisor are aligned in terms of, what your job duties are. Like little basic things like this, I think are really, really helpful. Again, introductions, understanding. I mean, there's so much in organizations, right, that functions under the surface, like those norms, those cultural things about an organization. And if you don't orient your employees to that, they're lost. Right? They're lost right away, right? And that's where you get these incidents of reality shock. of like, what? Well, why? Like you were mentioning, well, in school I was taught to do it this way. What do you mean you guys don't do it? Like, what's happening? And so again, just being sure that introductory period, socialization period, that somebody's monitoring that and helping with that. Because if they're not, that can lead to all sorts of problems.
Great. A follow-up question to that is, what do we do as an employee if the onboarding we know is not great? What can we do?
That's a tough question. And of course, it's, that my favorite answer in human resources is it depends, because it very much does depend. But I think as an employee, if you're aware of this, it depends on your position, right? If you're the supervisor, well, there's a lot you can do about it, right? You can make sure that this type of stuff happens. If you're not, again, very much depends on the context, the organization, but to the extent that you can have any influence over that process, whether it's by helping the person yourself, if it's a new colleague, making sure that you help and assist, whether it's saying to your boss, if you share the same boss, saying, hey, you know what, I've noticed, so-and-so has joined the organization, but, have we shared, relevant information with them? Have we gotten them up to speed on the projects we're working on? If you're noticing things, say something.
Thank you. There was clarification. I liked what you were saying, but the clarification is, what if we are the new grad and our onboarding is not great?
Oh, I see. I think it's fair. Again, it depends on your level of comfort with, in particular with your supervisor. But I do think it's fair for the person entering to say, hey, wait a minute. See me over here? I'm new here and I'm not really getting what I need, but I also think that person should be prepared to sort of say, what do I need? Right? Like, what would help me? What do I need to know to be successful? And again, ideally, that's a conversation that's just natural between an employee and their supervisor. But of course, we know that very often isn't natural. Might be worth also reaching out to the HR department. Again, depends on your level of comfort with that, and finding out, like, does the organization have some sort of onboarding process? Maybe it's just not being followed in your case. All of these are potential options, but I recognize it is a challenge for the new graduate themselves, because they often feel like they aren't in a position of power, right? And if they speak up and say anything, that they're going to be seen sort of as less desirable as an employee, which isn't the case. I do think it is fair, though, for them to say, wait a minute, my experience hasn't been optimal, and what can we do about it in a professional sort of way?
Yeah, that does take a lot of courage, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Another question, do you think your research could be used by MacEwan to assist them with supporting new faculty?
Yes, I think new faculty are a unique context, but definitely I think, onboarding and socialization is, a process that all organizations deal with, right? And so MacEwan in that instance is no different in terms of whether it's onboarding, staff members, onboarding faculty members, onboarding students for that matter, right? We pay a lot of attention to onboarding our students, right? And sort of new student orientation, those types of initiatives. Recognizing this year that's looked different, but generally speaking, we pay some attention to that. Sometimes I think we do pay some attention to new faculty, but I would say there's probably work we could do there as well. And that, yes, definitely some of this would apply to that same thing.
Thank you. I'm getting lots of great ideas about how to onboard new faculty that are coming in July. So another question, if I am the new grad, what do you think are some of the first must-dos on my first day or my first week?
Oh, yeah, that's, again, a hard question, not knowing the professional context. But I think, the onus on you is to ask a lot of questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. It's kind of like any interview, they're asking you kind of all the questions and you have to respond. And then usually at the end, there's a time where they say, hey, what questions do you have for us? I think the socialization period, or that transition period, is very much a time for the new person who's joining to be able to ask all those questions, right? We kind of joke in business that you sort of have 90 days, right? That's kind of the generally accepted time frame where you can ask any question, and nobody's going to wonder about that, right? You can be like, hey, I'm new here. I've been here like a month. What about this, or what about that? So I'd really encourage new graduates to do that early and often, right? Like if there's something that you don't understand, if there's something that's not clear, if there's something you want to know, be proactive and ask those questions up front. Because I think that will just, again, the more that you sort of understand and start to learn about the dynamic of your organization, the more that's going to help you in terms of your own career.
Thank you. Any other follow-up comments, questions? Looks like we might have exhausted the questions.
Fair enough.
We'll just give it. It's interesting. My husband is an engineer, and so I've heard a lot about the engineering training. And at that time, to really date him, it was only 2 years. So it's interesting to hear it's 4 now. So.
Yes, well, and full disclosure, my husband is also an engineer. And many of his family members are also engineers. So, I experience a lot of this in my day-to-day life as well. And it is interesting to hear him sort of reflect on his journey through that profession. And even, again, in the 25 years that he's been involved in it, how things have changed and not changed at the same time. As well. So yeah, it's and I mean, I've had the tremendous privilege of in particular following the careers of a number of female engineers, through my PhD journey all the way up till now. And it is, they are just some of the most resilient people, just creative and fantastic, and very much trailblazers, a lot of them, in terms of what they've been able to accomplish. And under not easy circumstances sometimes. So,
if I may indulge my own self, I was quite interested in your comments about the STEM and the idea that women in particular are pushed into the STEM careers as opposed to pulled into the STEM careers. And of course, being in a career that is female dominated and is now at times looked down on, that women shouldn't consider nursing. They're pushed to these STEM. I'm just wondering what you think about that and what that does to the careers that are sort of being stigmatized.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question. I would say that teaching is much the same, right, as nursing in that respect, in that largely field female dominated, pardon me. Yeah, and I don't think the intent is necessarily to look down upon other careers, but I understand that sometimes that comes across like that, right? That, oh, well, you shouldn't be a teacher or you shouldn't be a nurse because, that's what, women have done historically, and, we need to change that. I don't think that at all. But I do think that hopefully what some of this work does is open up the opportunity for, like I shared about my daughter at the beginning, that, if she wants to pursue nursing, fantastic. If she wants to pursue teaching, fantastic. But that the option is also open to her, that in an equal way in her mind, that if she wants to pursue one of these STEM careers, that there isn't that stigma attached to it. That I'm going to be, 1 out of 100 in my class who are female, which some of these women in these STEM careers, that's their experience. And so I just want it to sort of be a level playing field. Not that any of the professions are looked down upon or that's one are better than the other, but just more that there's the opportunity is open and that it's just a natural thing. Well, of course, why wouldn't I? Right. The challenge becomes that, it is when the kids are young that this socialization process starts, right? And that they're sort of like, well, girls should be this and boys should be this. And that's what I want to challenge, right? Is that no, that's not the case. Shouldn't be the case, right? And in the case of nursing, for example, hey, if boys want to be nurses, amazing, right? There shouldn't be a stigma around that either, right? So it kind of works both ways, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I do agree with you. I have daughters too, and I hope that everything is open to them. I don't feel like men are pushed, as is your word, to look at these other careers. They're also pushed to go into STEM. So it's just an interesting dynamic that is happening, and I don't expect you to have the answers. There's lots of thank yous in the chat, so I want you to know. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank
Great
you.
session. Thank you. Yeah, there's some clapping hands for
Thanks,
you.
Chris.
Any final comments, questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Another thanks with lots of exclamation marks. I'm not sure if you can see the chat or not. So
No, I don't see any of the main chat here for some reason. So
well,
I think I only see messages that are directed to me. So no, I don't see any.
I think generally over your presentation was well received. So it doesn't seem to be any more questions. So I want to thank you. Fascinating research that you're doing. I'd love to touch base with you.
Yeah,
At,
absolutely.
some other point. So
absolutely.
Now I have your name. I'll be.
You know where to find me.
Some of that, yeah, that cross-faculty research we're always talking about, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And there's some other good ones coming up. So good sessions. So be sure to check them out.